Hello, and a very warm welcome to this Debating Europe panel, where our experts respond to your questions and comments on Europe in this, the latest in a series of debates on the future of healthcare, run in partnership with MSD, called Healthcare Next, a citizen-centric approach. Today we are asking, how can Europe ensure that antibiotics never stop working? My name is Jackie Davis. I'll be moderating this debate, and with me to discuss this, delighted to welcome Sophie Neuer, Director of Public Policy at MSD, and Mark Gitzinger, President of the BEAM Alliance, biotech companies from Europe innovating in antimicrobial resistance research, and Mark is also Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Bioversis. A very warm welcome to both of you. So in this discussion, I'm going to be putting to Sophie and Mark some of the questions that you, Debating Europe readers and viewers, have sent in. So let's crack on and we'll get through as many of those as we can in the next 30 minutes. By the way, before we start, if you want to tweet about what you are hearing in this discussion, please do, and please use the hashtags Future of Europe, Health for All, or Health Systems. Okay, let us dive straight in. And first, we're going to have a question from Carolina, who's a medical student.
Hello, I'm Carolina, I'm a medical student, and my question regarding antimicrobial resistance and antibiotics is we have done multiple studies about this subject. We are now aware of many of the data and how this happens in many countries, but apparently it's still a quiet pandemic in a way. We have been trying to do something about this for a long time, and doesn't this show that there's a real lack of understanding? Or are we just not giving enough attention to this problem? How can we have politics that make us work towards this main goal as an union?
So quite a big question. So let's break that down into two parts, if we might. And Sophie, maybe I could start with you. The World Health Organization has declared antimicrobial resistance, AMR, to be one of the top 10 global health threats facing humanity. Can you just explain to our viewers why there are such grave concerns about antibiotics stopping working, and why are we in this situation?
Thank you, Jackie. So antimicrobial resistance, AMR, is the ability of a bacteria or of a virus to adapt over time and to stop responding to the medication, stop responding to antimicrobials such as antibiotics or antivirals. So that means that in practice, AMR makes illnesses harder to cure. I think it's important to note that resistance, AMR, is a natural process. It occurs naturally over time. But there are a series of factors, several factors that have actually, I think, accelerated this phenomenon. One of the factors is obviously the inappropriate use of antibiotics, but you also have additional factors such as the lack of hygiene or prevention measures in place. It means that even if you have very good practices in place, resistance will occur, AMR will happen. So you can slow down this phenomenon by better stewardship practices, but you cannot stop this phenomenon from happening, which means that in the end, you will always need to develop novel antimicrobials to have options, treatment.
And let's come back on those antimicrobials, those new options for treatment. So as you say, you can slow it down. We'll also come back, I hope, on issues of stewardship and all of that a bit later on. But if I could come to you, Mark, in terms of the reasons, is there anything you would add in terms of why we are in this situation? And our questioner referred to it being a quiet pandemic. People often talk about the silent pandemic. Do you think this issue is getting the attention it deserves? Is it high enough up the policy agenda at this stage, or do we need to focus on this a great deal more?
Thank you, Jackie. I think quickly adding to what Sophie has said, why is actually AMR one of the top 10 global health topics? I think what we really have to think about and internalize again as citizens is the importance of antibiotics. We cannot forget that this is really the infrastructure of our healthcare system. We have so many interventions of modern medicine that totally rely on the access of working antibiotics. And we are now in a situation where more and more this isn't the case anymore. We have too many infections and bacteria that are now totally resistant to many of our working antibiotics. And that causes huge issues. And why it's the silent pandemic, it's since many years, it's creeping up slowly and continuously, and maybe in the Western world a bit slower than in some of the low and mid-income countries. But it's not stopping at borders. It is now here. And I start to think it's actually more becoming a loud pandemic and crying out loud, actually. We need to do something. And is it enough that we do, and does it get the right attention? I think since 2015, we actually do get a fair bit of attention on the topic. The UK was leading this with Dame Sally Davis and Jim O'Neill, the first big report on the topic. And that was a landmark report. And a lot of things have happened. National action plans from countries have been put in place. We have helped to finance a bit the earlier stages of research in this space, with increasing so-called push funding, so grant funding for research in early stages. The biggest thing that hasn't changed at all yet is, unfortunately, the later stage of the reimbursement of antibiotics. We don't value these drugs for what they are in our healthcare system today.
I want to come back on what the problem is and why we're struggling so much with that in a moment. But Sophie, just in terms of the attention being devoted to this issue, as Mark says, it really has risen up the agenda. There is more and more awareness. But is that translating, do you think, into the actions that we need by policymakers, by healthcare professionals, by patients, and indeed by industry that we're going to need if we're really going to find an answer?
So before responding to your question, Jackie, I just wanted to make sure that people understand that without effective antibiotics, that means that actually very day-to-day simple procedures that are happening today will no longer be safe. With no effective antibiotics, clearly that means that you do not have safe surgery, that you do not have organ transplantation or chemotherapy that is happening in a safe space and that is being effective. That affects all of us as patients. As Mark said, I think that a lot of attention clearly has been given. I was looking at the various declarations, statements that have happened over the past, let's say, 7 to 10 years. The European Commission had adopted the One Health Action Plan back in 2017 that was followed up by a progress report. In 2020, the Commission also put AMR very high on the agenda in the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, so clearly giving it a lot of attention. This year alone, the HERA, the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response, actually declared AMR as one of its top 3 health threats. So top 10 in the WHO list, top 3 in the HERA list. So that's not anything. And I'm not mentioning the G7 or G20 declarations as well. So you could see a lot of attention. But I think, as Mark was saying, the attention and implementation is more with regard to national action plans, to surveillance systems, to awareness and campaigns in order to make sure people understand that you do not need to take an antibiotic for any reason.
Let us begin to delve into what can be done, and there are a number of issues here, and we'll take them a little bit in turn. Let's take a question now from Fanny.
Hello, my name is Fanny, and I would like to know what we could do to avoid bacterial resistance to the actual antibiotics that we use.
Just in terms of what has been done, Mark, we have made progress. We have an alliance like yours, the companies you represent, working on these innovative solutions on kits to tackle AMR. How much progress have we made, and how much more remains to be done?
Yeah, I think there has really been progress that we can be proud of on the policy side, on the industry side, actually virtually on all sides. But there's one big thing missing, and let me maybe quickly list first what has been good. We have really been reinvigorating early stage research. We have been giving grants to universities. We have been actually giving research money to companies, small and medium-sized companies, etc. The large industry has created the AMR Action Fund. We have industry initiatives for responsible manufacturing, surveillance systems. The WHO works with surveillance systems, with sustainable use campaigns, etc., etc. So lots of good things. The big elephant in the room hasn't been addressed appropriately, though. and that is rewarding innovation and valuing antibiotics for their social economic value that they actually have. Today, most antibiotics are, you can buy them for pennies. This is even true for generics. They're cheaper than a good piece of chocolate. And that really doesn't work in my eyes, because it is life-saving drugs. Within a few days, you're either healed or it goes really downhill. And new antibiotics suffer from that as well, because they come in at relatively low price points. And at the same time, we are totally supportive of having a sustainable use, so using them only when appropriate. And that combined shows that, this old economic system of linking the return on the volume sold can't work anymore.
Okay, we'll talk about what can work in just a moment. But Sophie, in terms of the progress we've made, Mark highlighting there the positives, but this big elephant in the room that he spoke about. In terms of the positive first, where do you see the real progress that's been made? And then, as I say, let's come to that elephant in the room and why it's not working at the moment, that incentivizing of companies like yours, like Mark's members, to invest in new antimicrobials. But in terms of the assessment of progress made.
Well, Mark has already highlighted a lot of the industry's initiatives, and I think that's absolutely right. I think industry has taken its role very seriously and has made a lot of efforts in order to make sure that we can address AMR appropriately. I think more generally, the key strategic pillars to address AMR globally are known, and members and the states at the EU level and countries in general across the globe are actually also implementing a number of these pillars. What is it? It's improve awareness of AMR, so awareness campaigns. I'm French. 10 years ago, they have launched a fantastic campaign on antibiotics are not automatic. So this type of awareness raising with broad audience and patients as well. So that's the first pillar. A second pillar is to strengthen the knowledge through surveillance to better understand the trends of resistance. So that's also happening. The CDC is doing a great job, I think, at the EU level on this. Another pillar is indeed to reduce the incidence of infections. What does that mean? Better hygiene measures, infection prevention measures, the promotion of vaccines. So that's another of the pillars. And more generally, protect the efficacy of the existing medicines through the promotion of diagnostics. That's what we mentioned a bit earlier as well. The fifth bucket, back to what Mark was saying, that helps fight against AMR is definitely the development of novel antibiotics. This is a key pillar as well. And back to what we were saying earlier, this is where actually we have failed to see progress over the past years. We're mentioning all these statements and declarations from governments about the need to invest in novel pipeline and novel medicines. But I think that beyond the declarations, very little has actually effectively taken place on this pipeline perspective.
Thank you. And Mark, why is this such an elephant in the room? Why are we not seeing progress? Because of this broad agreement, the current system of incentives doesn't work, doesn't reward innovation, doesn't de-risk those upfront investments. Why do you think that is? And there are some ideas I know out there for how we could solve this. Could you just tell us a little bit about the sort of approaches that are being suggested? I've heard talk of something called the transferable exclusivity extension. How might that work, for example?
Yes, can I maybe start first by saying why this is so incredibly important? We have heard of the issue, we have heard of where we are, but without new antibiotics in the development pipeline, and the development pipeline is really scaringly empty, we have a huge issue as we understood now. These days, it's mainly 80% of that pipeline are in the hands of small and medium-sized companies. And when I say small and medium-sized, it's actually lying. I should say small and micro companies. These are between 1 and maximum 9 employees, most of them. And we leave this in a totally financially fragile situation with very small teams. Fragile situation means that we have most of these companies have funding for maximum 12, 18 months, if not less. That means what we see today is a lot of these new developments not going forward, not because of scientific or development issues, but because of pure financial issues. What do we need to solve, and why is it so hard? I think it's always hard for policymakers in the middle of a crisis to change somehow the reimbursement and economic system. But we have had now over nearly 10 years so many reports detailing really how it can work. And there's two main streams in that. One is a so-called subscription model or Netflix model. We all know this these days. So the government.
How does it work for antibiotics, the Netflix model?
The government would subscribe to having access to the antibiotic and then decide itself how much it's needed and used, right? So the physicians are back in the driver's seat to say, this patient now needs a new antibiotic because it's here appropriate. He or she suffers from a resistant infection, etc. But the government has already paid the bill basically up front by paying for access. So that's one option. And the other option you mentioned beforehand is the transferable exclusivity. In that case, a company that develops a new antibiotic, small or big, would get a so-called voucher. And this voucher can be used in another pipeline program internally or sold onwards for any of the drugs that is already on the market and making decent turnaround to get 1 year, for instance, exclusivity extension. And that voucher has, of course, a value. So if a small and medium-sized company like us would actually develop something successfully, bring it to the market, get approval for it, then we can take this voucher and sell it on to someone else because our pipelines are focused totally on antibiotics and the other group will pay for that.
And just to understand, that is effectively delinking the question of financial reward from the volume of prescriptions, the volumes of sales, because the whole point with antibiotics is to use as little of them as possible. Do I understand that right?
That is correct. Both of these mechanisms would delink the volume from sales from the return and would allow small companies to actually get the return. The question now is how to translate that into action. And here we come to the different kind of solutions that are more feasible in one part of the world compared to others.
Okay.
And we believe that in Europe, the transferable exclusivity voucher is the most feasible because it doesn't request of the 27 member states first to put a pot of money together and put all the money in there to then, serve the subscription model. It would actually distribute the burden over time to all the 27 member states in a pretty much equal manner.
So, Sophie, how important could this be? How much difference could that make, do you think?
Well, as Mark was saying, we very much need to revitalize the antimicrobial R&D pipeline. And I think that basically you need to reward the successful innovation at a level that is sufficient to attract the investment. And we believe also that the TE would be the right incentive precisely to attract this investment required. And overall, I think bring a sustainable return on investment. If I can add up to what Mark was saying, I think one of the benefits of a TE also is that it can be easily implemented via EU level legislation. So it's indeed something that can be done. The European Commission is actually considering it ahead of the upcoming proposal on the pharmaceutical legislation review. I think it's also important to note that it does not require upfront funding from member states because you are transferring this voucher. So no upfront funding, which is, I think, important to stress, considering the billions of euros that are required to develop a novel antimicrobial. And I think that TE would support actually not only SMEs, but all pharmaceutical companies of all sizes, of course, including SMEs, but also larger pharmaceutical companies. I think larger pharmaceutical companies also play a decisive role in late stage development of novel antimicrobials, and they're also the ones which make possible, I think, the fact that patients ultimately get access to the novel antimicrobial and the distribution role as well. So I think this would benefit all companies across the spectrum.
Okay, let's come back to another aspect of this that you've both touched on. We have a question relating to stewardship, as it's called. Let us hear the question.
I have a question. For example, in Portugal, the prescribers, the doctors, use antibiotics without the embryogram, without the test results. This should be forbidden because it leads to a higher resistance in the bacteria. How can we have strictly policies and limit this kind of prescription from the doctors?
So, Sophie, let me come to you. You mentioned right at the beginning the ways in which we could slow down the development of antimicrobial resistance, things we can do. And one of those aspects relates to what is called in the industry stewardship, trying to reduce their use. Our questioner, what do you say to our questioner about how do we do this? That was about doctors specifically. But more broadly, because patients and healthcare professionals generally are involved, what would you say about what we need to do here, and what is MSD doing in this area?
Thank you, Jackie. So perhaps it would be worthwhile actually defining what stewardship is, because I know that not everybody is necessarily familiar with the concept. There is this formula that I think very appropriate, according which stewardship is the right drug at the right time for the right patient at the right duration and right dose. So drug, time, patient, duration, and dose. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be using antibiotics. That means that you have to make sure patients get the right treatment for their affection. And it's about obviously avoiding inappropriate use. But again, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use them at all. Just make sure that the patients have what they need. Annan, I think, was mentioning the fact that indeed stricter policies should be in place. And I think that from an industry perspective, I'd like to stress that the AMR Industry Alliance has actually made a commitment that's specifically related and targeting appropriate use. So for those of you and for the audience who is not familiar necessarily with the Alliance, the AMR Industry Alliance is actually one of the largest private sector coalitions, which aims at precisely fighting AMR, and that's composed of over 100 of biotech companies, diagnostic companies, generics, as well as research-based pharmaceutical companies. So one of the commitments of the AMR Industry Alliance is appropriate use by, for example, reducing inappropriate use through I would say programs and education awareness campaigns, making sure that we can generate the right evidence, make sure we can understand the resistance trends. For this, basically, surveillance data is critical. Also, that means that we commit to ensure that any promotional activity for antibiotics is aligned with the goal of advancing stewardship. So all of these measures are already in place, and this is the way we are actually making sure that proper stewardship is implemented.
Okay, Mark, a brief one if you would, because I want to squeeze in another question from Debating Europe users in a moment. But on this issue of stewardship, specifically this issue of over-prescribing of antibiotics that our questioner points to, what would you say to that?
It needs a bit of a cultural change from doctors and patients as well. Patients, like I'm suffering right now myself from a flu. I hope you can't hear it too much. But then I shouldn't run to the doctor and request an antibiotic because most likely it's not yet bacterial. And so there's a cultural change. There's the doctors that need to change a little bit. But the foremost and most important point for me is, again, unfortunately, the circle turns often to an economic point, and that is diagnostic. We actually do have diagnostic tools today available for community-acquired bacterial infections and also for very severe hospital-acquired bacterial infections to identify if it is bacterial, to identify if the bug is resistant, and to really have then the appropriate therapy that Sophie mentioned given to that patient. But these diagnostics are not often used, and they are not often used because they are not reimbursed in most countries. And even the 100 euros for actually paying that diagnostic test in a hospital setting, for instance, is often too expensive to actually make that happen. And that, for me, is unacceptable because we're not giving the appropriate therapy today.
Okay, let's squeeze in another question from a user. This one comes from an anonymous questioner.
Due to the fact that we are well acquainted with the mechanisms against which bacteria developed antibiotic resistance, whether or what new classes of antibiotics with a different mechanisms of action are currently being studied.
Mark, you talked about the cupboard being pretty bare in terms of the pipeline, but how many new ones are in the pipeline, and are they using different mechanisms? And perhaps then, Sophie, a word about something I know was launched, the AMR, the Global AMR Action Fund, and how that is working to try and address these issues. But Mark first.
Thank you. Yeah, we have roughly a pipeline of 70 to 80 clinical development programs in place at the moment. Not all of them are totally new classes, but certainly all of them address an unmet medical need in patients. And I think before we always run and ask for novelty, novelty doesn't mean that no resistance will exist afterwards. That is just not true. Bacteria will adopt to any mechanism of action. The question is how fast and how sustainable do we use the antibiotic. For me, the most important part in the developments is to have something that really overcomes today's resistance issues and gives a patient benefit going forward. That's why we develop drugs. So if novel or not, it needs to overcome the issues. And I think there's quite a bit in the pipeline, but far too little for the magnitude that is out there, because we have several bacterial infections, several sites of infection in the human body, etc. And if you think of only just one, for instance, small niche cancer program, you have at least 80, 100, etc. more programs running against that very particular niche versus, 70 to 80 programs against the entire universe of bacterial infections.
Thank you very much. And this global AMR action fund that was set up in 2020, $1 billion was put into it to try to act as a sort of bridge to address some of these issues. Sophie, what is it doing? And is it the answer? Or if it's not, what more do we need?
So indeed, the AMR Action Fund is actually a partnership, a coalition of 20 leading biopharmaceutical companies, as well as the European Investment Bank and the Wellcome Trust, which is a UK charity. And that partnership actually has a very ambitious goal, which is to bring between 2 to 4 new antibiotics to patients by the end of this decade, by 2030. And more generally, I think to create also a sustainable ecosystem of investment and of innovation. Because the AMR Action Fund, what it does is that it makes investments in small and mid-sized biotech companies that are developing antimicrobial therapeutics. And the idea, of course, is to take action to sustain the fragile antibiotic pipeline. You mentioned $1 billion as a budget. That being said, is the solution, Jackie? I think it's a temporary solution. Industry is taking its role, I think, very seriously, and it shows that we are trying to play our part in fighting AMR, in trying to fix the pipeline situation. But it's already only a temporary solution because we believe that governments and the European Union as well should also take its part. We cannot, as industry, act alone. We need to have also government support through incentives, the EU support through incentives. And if these no incentives are not in place, actually the future of the antibiotic innovation is at serious risk.
So as you're saying, it's that ecosystem, that sustainable ecosystem, and that ongoing collaboration between all the people who need to be involved if we're to find solutions. A final question to you both from me. And Mark, I mean, we know and we've heard this is a key priority for the WHO. We've also heard it's a key priority, a top 3 priority for HERA, the EU's Emergency Response Authority, and it's a key central plank of the European pharmaceutical strategy. If you had to identify a key priority, something policymakers really need to do, accepting that this is something that needs to be tackled holistically. You've mentioned value assessment, you've mentioned reimbursement, as well as this question of incentives. What for you is the key priority if we are to be able to say that we are really responding to the challenge and meeting the concerns of the Debating Europe viewers and users that we've been hearing from today? What for you is the most important thing we need to do? Same question to you both. Mark first.
There's one and only one key priority, and that is solving the reimbursement issue immediately. We need the private sector to be coming back in stronger with more money, and this can only be done with the reimbursement issue. We have the solution on the table. In Europe, it is most likely the TEE, the transferable exclusivity voucher, with certain guardrails that need to be implemented from policymakers so that there's no misuse and abuse, and that it is actually socially responsible, also in terms of how much money will be put into the system. But that is the solution, and we need implementation ASAP.
So we know what we need to do, we just need to do it. Sophie?
I completely agree with Mark. I think the key action is very much to fix the pipeline that's actually undergoing a valley of death journey. We need a predictable and sustainable return on investment. And I would like to take the example and the comparison with COVID-19. COVID-19, I think, has shown us what can happen when healthcare systems are not ready, when they're not prepared. But unlike COVID-19, AMR is not a surprise. We know that this is happening. We know that this could be the next pandemic. And so we very much need to take action now by putting forward new incentives. TE at the EU level, as Mark was saying, is certainly the best option we have in place to make sure ultimately that patients have access to effective antimicrobials. And I would very much like to stress the idea of making sure that patients are at the center of all this discussion ultimately.
Absolutely, and hence the title of this series of discussions, Healthcare Next, a citizen-centric approach. That's very much our focus. That is all we have time for. Thank you so much to both of you for a fascinating discussion, and thank you to all of you for watching, and to those of you who submitted questions for this debate. As I mentioned at the start, this is just one in a series of online discussions Debating Europe is running on the future of healthcare. If you would like to continue the debate, you can leave your questions or comments on the Debating Europe website, and you can check out the other debates in this series. And do look out for the next one coming soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.